Picture this. It's a cold November evening in 1810 London. Gas lamps flicker along Piccadilly Street as crowds of well-dressed Victorian ladies and gentlemen clutch their 2-shilling coins, rushing toward what they believe is the most extraordinary spectacle of their time. Behind the doors of the Egyptian Hall, locked in a cage barely 4.5 feet wide, stands a young African woman who has no idea she's about to become one of history's most exploited figures. Her name is Sarah Baartman. And tonight, as hundreds of strangers pay to stare at her body, poke her with sticks, and treat her like a wild animal, she's probably thinking about home, about the vast landscapes of South Africa where she once ran free. This is her story, and I promise you, it will change everything you think you know about human dignity, colonial exploitation, and the price one woman paid for simply being different. Stay with me, because what happened to Sara didn't just happen over 200 years ago. It's a story that echoes in our world today. Let me take you back to where it all began. The year is 1789. The same year the French Revolution exploded across Europe and George Washington became America's first president. But in a remote valley in the eastern Cape of South Africa, in what the Dutch colonizers called the Cape Colony, a baby girl takes her first breath under the endless African sky. Her name is Sarah Baartman, and she belongs to the Khoikhoi people, a proud community who had herded cattle across these lands for thousands of years. Imagine, if you will, the world Sara was born into. Picture rolling hills dotted with umbrella thorn trees, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, and the ancient songs of her people carried on the wind. The Khoikhoi had lived this way since immemorial, following the seasonal rains, respecting the land, living in harmony with nature's rhythms. But by 1789, this world was already dying. The Dutch East India Company had been strangling the Cape for over a century. What started as simply a refreshment station for ships sailing to Asia had become a brutal colonial machine that devoured everything in its path. Sara's parents, like thousands of other Khoikhoi, had already lost their freedom. Their cattle had been confiscated, their ancestral grazing lands claimed by Dutch settlers who arrived with pieces of paper declaring ownership of soil that had never belonged to anyone. When Sara is just 2 years old, her mother dies. Can you imagine? A toddler reaching for arms that will never hold her again, calling for a voice that has fallen silent forever. In the Khoikhoi tradition, a child would have been embraced by the entire community, but colonial disruption had scattered families like seeds in a storm. Sara grows up fast, too fast. By her teens, she's already learned that survival means complete self-reliance. Then comes another devastating blow. Her father, forced to work as a cattle driver for their colonial masters, is killed by sand hunters during what should have been a routine job. The Sand people, whom the colonizers cruelly called Bushmen, were the oldest inhabitants of southern Africa. They've been pushed deeper and deeper into the harsh Kalahari Desert by both advancing Khoikhoi herders and European settlers. Desperation sometimes drove them to raid cattle herds, and Sara's father became another casualty of this complex web of colonial violence. Now picture 16-year-old Sara, orphaned and alone, in a world that's changing faster than anyone can comprehend. Following the customs of her people, she marries young. Her husband is also Khoikhoi, a drummer who tries to keep their cultural traditions alive even as everything around them crumbles. For a brief moment, Sara experiences joy when she gives birth to a child. But in a world where colonial disruption has destroyed traditional support systems, tragedy strikes again. Her baby dies shortly after birth, leaving Sara heartbroken and even more isolated. It's around this time that a free black trader named Peter Caesars enters Sara's life. Now, understand the historical context here. In 1795, the British had seized the Cape Colony from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars. The Cape was becoming a strategic chess piece in European power games, and people like Sara were simply pawns to be moved around the board. Records claim that Peter convinced Sara to move to Cape Town, But given the power dynamics at the time, it's more likely she had no choice. Cape Town in the early 1800s was a bustling port city where ships from around the world docked to resupply. It was also a place where human dignity was bought and sold daily. Sarah worked there for 2 years, first as a nursemaid to Peter, then as a servant to a Dutchman. It was here that they stripped away even her name, calling her Saki, a diminutive Dutch version of Sarah. This might seem like a small thing, but imagine having your very identity erased, replaced with whatever your masters found convenient. Though legally Sarah wasn't enslaved, practically she was. She lived in terrible conditions and was treated exactly like the enslaved people around her. And just when she dared to hope for love again, colonial violence struck once more. Her fiancé was killed by colonists, leaving her heart shattered for what seemed like the 100th time. Then she went to work for Peter's brother Hendrik Caesars, in what is now Woodstock. Here, Sarah worked as a wet nurse, a job that involved breastfeeding other people's children. This was typically work done by the most desperate women, those who had no other options. During this time, she began a relationship with a poor Dutch soldier named Hendrik van Jong. For a moment, Sarah might have imagined a different future, but the regiment moved on, and once again, Sarah was left behind, her heart breaking a little more each time. Now, I want you to imagine Sarah at this point in her life. She's in her early 20s, she's lost her parents, her husband, her child, her fiancé, and her lover. She's working as a servant in a society that sees her as less than human. She's strong, intelligent, and speaks multiple languages, but none of that matters to the people who control her life. She's surviving, day by day, in a world that seems determined to crush her spirit. Then one day, everything changes. Enter William Dunlop, a Scottish military surgeon who has a side business supplying British showmen with exotic animals and curiosities. When he sees Sarah, he doesn't see a human being with feelings, dreams, and dignity. He sees profit. You see, Sarah had steatopegia, a genetic condition common among Khoikhoi women that caused large deposits of fat in the buttocks. To Dunlop's calculating eyes, this made her perfect for the freak shows that were becoming wildly popular in early 19th century Britain.
This was the era of what we now call human zoos, a time when Europeans satisfied their curiosity about the wider world by gawking at people from other cultures as if they were exotic animals. The more different someone looked from European standards, the more money could be made from displaying them. Dunlop knew that Sarah's appearance would make him wealthy beyond his dreams. But Sarah refused. Can you imagine the courage that took? Here was this powerful European man offering her what he probably presented as an opportunity, and she said no? But Dunlop was persistent. He kept pushing, kept promising, kept manipulating. Finally, Sarah agreed, but only on one condition. Hendrik Caesars had to come with her. Hendrik initially refused too, but debt was crushing him. He'd made bad business decisions, taken out loans he couldn't repay, and clients weren't paying him. The promise of easy money from Sarah's exhibition was too tempting to resist, and so on October 29, 1810, Sarah supposedly signed a contract agreeing to work as a servant and exhibit herself for entertainment. But here's the thing that should make your blood boil. Sarah couldn't read. She was illiterate, and the contract was in English. She had no idea what she was really agreeing to. She kept no copy of the contract, which meant her exploiters could change the terms whenever they wanted. The contract did promise her two things that gave her hope. After 5 years, she could return to South Africa and she would receive a portion of the earnings. These promises would prove to be as worthless as the paper they were written on. In the winter of 1810, Sarah boarded a ship bound for London. As the South African coastline disappeared behind her, she was leaving behind everything she had ever known. Whether she went willingly or was forced, we'll never truly know. But by this point, did she really have a choice? London in November 1810 was a city of extreme contrasts. While the wealthy enjoyed unprecedented luxury, the poor lived in conditions that would horrify us today. The Industrial Revolution was transforming Britain, but it was also creating massive social inequalities. Into this world stepped Sarah Baartman, about to become the most famous African woman in Europe, for all the wrong reasons. Dunlop had everything prepared. Sara was to be exhibited immediately at the Egyptian Hall on Piccadilly Street, the same street where today tourists shop for souvenirs and take selfies. For just 2 shillings, crowds could come and stare at Sara as she was forced to sing, walk, and display her body. She was kept in a cage barely 4.5 feet high. Visitors could poke her with sticks as if she were a dangerous animal. Wealthy patrons paid extra for private showings in their homes, treating Sara like a party entertainment. The advertisements for the show are painful to read even today. They described Sara as if she were livestock, mentioning her height, her supposed capacity, and making up stories about her homeland. They claimed that in her country, a bottle of brandy or small roll of tobacco will purchase several sheep, feeding into racist stereotypes about African people and their supposed primitive nature. But not everyone in London was comfortable with what was happening to Sara. The African Association, led by influential abolitionists, heard about her treatment and decided to take legal action. At the forefront was Zachary Macaulay, a powerful figure in the anti-slavery movement who had helped pass the 1807 Slave Trade Act. He was also one of the founders of what would become University College London. These were people with real influence, and they were appalled by Sara's treatment. The trial took place on November 24, 1810, just weeks after Sara's first performances. The courtroom was packed as lawyers argued whether Sara was being exhibited with her consent or under duress. The abolitionists presented compelling evidence of abuse and exploitation, but then Sara herself was called to testify, and with William Dunlop sitting right there in the courtroom, she stated that she was not under restraint, had not been sexually abused, and had come to London of her own free will. Can you imagine the pressure she must have felt? Here's a young woman who barely speaks English, standing in a British courtroom filled with powerful white men, with her supposed manager staring at her, being asked to expose the very people who control every aspect of her life. The written contract, which she couldn't read, was presented as evidence that she had agreed to everything. The case was dismissed. Dunlop and Caesars faced no charges. But the trial did result in some improvements to Sara's contract. She was supposed to receive better treatment, more money, and decent living conditions. Whether these promises were kept is unclear, but what we do know is that the publicity from the trial made Sara's shows even more popular. For the next few years, Sara traveled throughout Britain and Ireland, performing for crowds who saw her as the ultimate exotic curiosity. She was even baptized in Manchester in 1814, perhaps hoping that embracing Christianity might somehow improve her situation. It was during this period that William Dunlop died, but Sara's exploitation was far from over. Enter Henry Taylor, who had heard about Sara's shows and saw an opportunity to bring this sensation to France. In 1814, as Napoleon was finally defeated and exiled to Elba, Paris was hungry for new entertainments and diversions. Taylor convinced Sara to cross the English Channel, probably with the same false promises that had brought her to London in the first place. Initially, things seemed different in Paris. Sara became involved with French society and even attended gatherings at famous cafes. For a brief moment, she might have hoped for a different kind of life. But within weeks of arriving in France, Taylor sold her to an animal trainer named Rios, who was connected to the Museum of Natural History. If Sara's treatment in London was degrading, what happened in Paris was pure horror. She was exhibited like a circus animal, often locked in a cage next to baby rhinoceroses and other exotic creatures. The French audiences demanded even more explicit displays than the British had. Sara was presented nearly naked for every performance, and there are reports that she was sometimes forced to wear a collar around her neck, like a dog.
Despite being offered more money, Sara maintained one last shred of dignity. She refused to appear completely naked, always insisting on wearing a small apron-like garment. There was reportedly only one occasion when she was forced to appear fully nude, and witnesses said you could see in her eyes that she knew this was the final destruction of her dignity. The French scientific community became obsessed with Sara. This was the era when European racial science was developing, pseudoscientific theories that would later be used to justify colonialism, slavery, and ultimately the Holocaust. Leading anatomist Georges Cuvier examined Sara extensively, claiming she represented a missing link between animals and humans. These examinations were invasive, dehumanizing, and conducted without any regard for Sara's feelings or consent. Sara's final 15 months in Paris were a living nightmare. She lived in poverty worse than anything she had experienced before. She was sexually abused and became pregnant by Rayo. She gave birth to a son she named Okura, but the child died at age 5 from unknown causes. Sara was now completely alone in a foreign country, with no friends, no family, and no hope of escape. On December 29, 1815, just after Christmas, while families across Europe were celebrating, Sarah Baartman died in a cold Parisian garret. She was only 26 years old. The official cause of death was listed as inflammatory disease related to smallpox, but other sources suggest she might have died from alcoholism, pneumonia, or syphilis. The truth is, it hardly matters. Sara died of a broken heart, of systematic dehumanization, of a world that saw her as a commodity rather than a human being. But even death couldn't free Sara from exploitation. Georges Cuvier immediately claimed her body and performed a detailed autopsy, supposedly to determine the cause of death, but really to satisfy his scientific curiosity about her anatomy. He preserved her brain, skeleton, and sexual organs, which were then put on display at the Museum of Man in Paris. Let that sink in for a moment. Sara's most intimate parts were put on public display for tourists and scientists to gawk at. Her body, which she had fought so hard to keep covered during her lifetime, was exposed for all the world to see after her death. This continued for over 160 years. And here's something that might surprise you. Sarah Baartman was actually highly intelligent. She spoke her native Khoikhoi language, was fluent in Dutch, and could hold conversations in both French and English. She understood exactly what was happening to her, which makes her suffering even more heartbreaking. She wasn't the primitive creature that the advertisements described. She was a smart, capable woman who was trapped by circumstances beyond her control. Sara's remains stayed on display at French museums until 1974. Think about that. People were still staring at her body parts during the era of disco music and color television. It took years of campaigning and a personal request from Nelson Mandela before France finally agreed to repatriate her remains. On August 9, 2002, which is Women's Day in South Africa, Sarah Baartman finally came home. After 185 years of exile, exploitation, and display, she was buried in the Eastern Cape province where she belonged. Thousands of people attended her funeral, finally giving her the dignity and respect she had been denied in life. Sara's story didn't end, though, with her burial. She became a symbol of African resistance and the devastating impact of colonialism. Schools, streets, and institutions across South Africa bear her name. Her story has inspired books, films, and academic studies that continue to challenge how we think about race, colonialism, and human dignity. But I want you to think about something as we reach the end of Sara's story. Her exploitation wasn't just the work of a few evil individuals. It was supported by entire societies that paid to see her suffer. It was justified by scientific institutions that claimed to be advancing human knowledge. It was enabled by legal systems that saw nothing wrong with treating a human being as property. The people who paid their 2 shillings to stare at Sara weren't monsters. They were ordinary citizens who convinced themselves that what they were doing was acceptable because Sara was different, because she was African, because she was a woman, because she was poor. They told themselves stories about civilization and progress while participating in pure human degradation. Sarah Baartman's story is ultimately about the cost of seeing other people as less than human. It's about what happens when difference becomes grounds for exploitation. It's about the courage of one woman who maintained her dignity even when the entire world was trying to strip it away. So the next time you see someone being treated unfairly because of how they look, where they come from, or how they speak, remember Sara. Remember that every person has a story, has feelings, has dignity that deserves respect. Remember that progress isn't just about technology or science. It's about how we treat each other as human beings. If Sara's story has moved you, if it's made you think differently about the world we live in, then please share it. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss future stories about remarkable people whose experiences shaped our world. Leave a comment below and let me know what struck you most about Sara's life. And please, share this video with others, because stories like Sara's need to be told and remembered. Sarah Baartman lived, suffered, and died so that we might understand something fundamental about human dignity. The least we can do is make sure her story is never forgotten again.